Well, Ian, here we have them. I mean, this is clearly Victorian. Even if you didn't know who made it, looking at the materiality, you would say this is Victorian. This is a copy. This is a copy of something that's really quite exceptional. It's exceptional in terms of who it was made for, when it was made, how it survived, how it has come to us here today, what it tells us about Tudor beds, and also about royalty at this particular time in the late 15th century. So why does this bed matter so much? What does it tell us?
It's been described as the manifesto of the early Tudor dynasty. This is the bed that brought together the warring houses of York and Lancaster, and they're seen here, Henry and Elizabeth, as Adam and Eve at a point of union, hand on chest, cusping the apple, and it is not the apple of sin, it's the apple of redemption, and they're showing themselves as redeemers of the country at a time of conflict at the end of the War of the Roses. Pivotal point in the country's history, and this sat within the heart of Westminster Palace, right there in the painted chamber. And as you've pointed out, this bed was seen as an extension of the king's body. So when the king was not in Westminster, the bed stood for the king's presence in Westminster and government.
You're talking about iconography, meaning, symbolism, property, identity. It's a piece of furniture, it doesn't matter. You know, in the grand scheme of things, it's not a building, it's not a painting. But you're talking about it as if it's a work of art.
It absolutely is a work of art. It transcends furniture. This is a work of art. And it would have been more akin to a painting than you realise when you look at it today, because this bed was completely painted in the most elaborate colours, including ultramarine from lapis, which was normally just reserved. It was more expensive than gold and normally just reserved for the gowns of the Virgin. This was an incredibly important piece of furniture.
And we can see that medieval paint, and it's medieval in preparation and layering.
Absolutely.
In fragments left on the bed.
On the headboard, on the footboard, and on the surviving crestings and on the lions. That paint scheme is there. It's sort of ubiquitous throughout the bed. And that tallies with the dendrochronology, which tells us that this bed was principally made, 13 pieces of it all coming from the same tree. So this is not something that's been cobbled up. This was a bespoke piece of furniture made for a very specific occasion and a very specific place in the heart of Westminster.
So you mentioned the footboard. The footboard is a problem for furniture historians who think that beds from this period don't have footboards. Footboards only come into existence on high status beds from the 19th century Gothic Revival beds. So this bed's really important, isn't it?
This bed is incredibly important. In terms of furniture history, it's important. I mean, people overuse the term important for a piece of furniture. This genuinely is an important piece of furniture. It played a part in the country's history.
Well, we can see here, can't we? The shields, France and England, which when combined, when they're quartered, as we can see on the cresting up there, that's the royal coat of arms. They're actually coming out of Mandola, which they're effectively birthing the country out of the foot of the bed.
Out of this bed,
And
the royal births took place on a pallet on the floor at the foot of an elaborately carved bedstead.
So for furniture historians who think that beds of this time are mainly all about drapery, about luxurious fabrics, this gives a completely different tale, doesn't it? This tells us something completely different, that actually incredibly high status beds were carved. They were vehicles of ideas. Expression of identity, status, regality.
Absolutely. I think there's also something that could be brought into that, Peter, and this is me just thinking off the cuff there, and I think it's something to do with permanence. You're carving this into oak, whereas as drapes are fragmentary. We look at the inventories, and even after drapes are a few years old, you look at the inventory, and how many times have you read rat-eaten and things like this, and the drapes are falling to bits, and they're not permanent. This is permanent. It's permanent.
Even the woodworm didn't do a very good job of getting rid of the
footboard. Well, it's here 540 years later. It was created with that sense of permanence to it. The dynasty was looked at that stage as something that was going to be permanent, and the bed was going to be permanent.
And not only did this bed spawn a whole Tudor dynasty.
Yeah, well, Arthur was believed to be conceived in it, probably born at the foot of it. Margaret Tudor was almost certainly born at the foot of it, and
Henry
it's not
VIII.
much of a stretch of the imagination to think Henry VIII could have been conceived and born
Yes.
at the foot of this bed. Literally the birthplace of the Tudor dynasty at a pivotal point in the nation's history.
And this bed itself spawned a whole other group of incredibly important Tudor beds, first among those the Thomas Stanley bed, so the bed made for the stepfather of Henry VII.
Yeah.
So it's incredibly important, I think, isn't it, in terms of what it tells us, this brand new snapshot of what high status pieces of furniture that transcend furniture could look like, but most of which have been destroyed during the Civil War. I mean, going through the Henry VIII post-mortem inventories, how many beds were there
Hundreds.
in Windsor Castle or throughout
Well,
the whole?
throughout all of his properties, hundreds of beds.
How many survive? Right, exactly.
A couple that we know of.
So, in other words, the comparisons we can make with this are so incredibly limited that the assumptions we've made about beds from this time are based upon examples like Van Eyck painted for the Arnolfini portrait. You know, this is incredibly precious because it has survived. And the fact that it has a footboard where the wood is of the same wood that makes the posts and is covered with the same type of medieval paint gives a whole new understanding of what beds could be, and also this incredibly significant headboard with iconography.
Yeah, and people are not used, furniture historians aren't used. Generally, you look at a piece of furniture and you're looking at it at its function and its design and its timber. You're not normally looking at iconography.
No.
It's something at this period you'd expect to be looking at iconography if you were looking at a tapestry, if you were looking at a painting, but at a piece of furniture, iconography doesn't normally enter into it. More heraldry, but not so much the iconography.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's why it's so important, isn't it? Because it's not just furniture, it's a statement of identity. It's Henry and Elizabeth saying, we are here. We are the new king and queen of the country. We are birthing the country out of our union. And at the base of the tree where we're being shown in this position of marriage, our authority almost for ruling all of England after the War of the Roses comes from Egbert, the first king of all England. Amazing.
Yeah.
So, incredibly precious. If we slide over to the left-hand side, what do we see here?
The George Shaw copy, yes.
What could you say? You've spent so much time with this, the Royal Tudor bed. Are you impressed by this?
I think I would have been impressed with this bed had I not seen the original. I would think this was quite a good bed. When you've got the original to compare it with, I just see it as a very, very crude, illiterate copy. But interestingly, I mean, this belonged to John Paul Getty at one stage, didn't it? At a certain place. And I think he also owned the
another copy made by George.
The other George Shaw copy as well. So it was presumably thought that it was a very good bed.
Yes, exactly. I mean, in the Getty collection, gosh.
And in the lack of Tudor originals, because at this stage nobody realised a Tudor original, never mind a Tudor royal original bed, had survived. So I suppose it's a reasonably good substitute for a Tudor original bed, isn't it?
I'm going to swoop in, I think, and just say a few things in defence of George. So George, a plucky teenager, 18-year-old, going around the country working for his family's woolen mill business, collecting pieces of ancient furniture, going to look at other people's collections of ancient furniture. He's collecting, he's drawing, he's studying, he's fixated on the past. This bed, well, to some extent, could pass for this bed if you're looking at pictures without the reality of the two of them together. Yeah. So this bed was copied by George, probably 1835 to 42-ish. And this bed can be seen here in being reproduced, smaller scale, cruder, pared back. And this is the first of a whole suite of at least maybe perhaps 5 other copies. So we know he produced a copy for the Duke of Northumberland, which he sold in 1847 as a genuine Tudor relic. Haha, here's the real one. Here's, the equivalent to the fake. Also the Earl of Bradford, the Townleys of Burnley. So there's a whole host of other beds. And so there's a bit of ingenuity here. George relies upon people not knowing about the existence of this bed in Moseley possession.
Or the existence of the other ones that he sold to various other members of the aristocracy.
Exactly, and he's sufficiently astute, no matter how crude perhaps the carving or the pared back iconography on the headboard or the footboard are, or how awfully deformed this very fast piece of green oak used to carve this front post are. He's incredibly ingenious in terms of the way that he's used this Tudor bed as the model for producing fake Tudor furniture sold to aristocrats, particularly in the north of England, but also as the basis for interior decoration, not only at his own house in Upper Mill, but also elsewhere in the country. So this bed is the fountainhead really of George's, not only his fakes, but also his architectural career. So in some ways, this bed is not only an incredible record of Tudor history and what furniture from that period could be like, but also how it could be harnessed by people who sort of know what they're doing. To George's credit, he recreated some of the very obvious things, very well. I mean, all this fish scale sort of carving here, this diaper work, the leaves and the flowers, the bratishing, it's all quite similar. If we have to ignore the headboard, which is just horribly simplified and it lacks all the sophistication and meaning of the Tudor original, but actually he's seen it, he's absorbed this information and he's reused it, he's reconstituted it, and he's, in that sense, incredibly clever, I think.
He is, yes.
And if other Gothic revival architects at the time had access to this material, gosh, it would have completely perhaps changed the course of 19th century design. But for George, he manages to churn out these copies of the beds at a clearly reduced scale, and people buy them as supposedly Tudor pieces. It's a wonderful testament not only to the bed significance, but also George's appreciation of its significance. If George could only be here today and actually see them compared, I think he would get a great kick out of it.
I think he would just be delighted to see that people were
still interested
and appreciating them.
Quite a lot of time and effort was put into working out where this bed went. And there have been various theories.
There were several theories, Peter. I mean, to begin with, people just thought it was so improbable that the bed had survived, because the prevailing thought was that nothing of this nature, nothing of a royal nature, and certainly nothing of a royal Catholic nature survived the dual impact of the Reformation and the Civil War.
Yes, because this is rather Catholic, isn't it?
Well, it was probably even more Catholic when it was still painted, because the banderole there would have been painted with we don't know what, but something inherently Catholic. So at some stage, following on from the Matthew Bible, we have the sting of death is sin, the strength of sin is the law, taken from Corinthians, incised, and not just painted onto there, incised in. Again, this permanence. So I think that's how it has survived, certainly the Reformation. It survived the Civil War because it has been gifted by Elizabeth I. Now, initially, our thoughts and everyone's thoughts was that it must have escaped from royal possession fairly early on, and there was a theory that it went up to Latham House and was left with Thomas Stanley and Margaret Beaufort, Henry's mother and stepfather, as early as 1495. However, we now know that that is not the case. Further research has shown that this bed is mentioned twice in the inventories, in the Whitehall inventory of Henry VIII, and then later in the post-mortem inventory, where, interestingly, the bed had moved from Whitehall to Windsor. And we know Elizabeth I had a bed museum in Windsor, and people were known to go there and visit. We further know that Elizabeth was in the habit of gifting beds to favoured courtiers, often at the point of knighthood. So we now know this bed, and it was a researcher who came about this by chance. Mention of a bed being gifted to Sir Nicholas Mosley, who had been Lord Mayor of London at the end of his tenure, for a new house he was building at Hoff End in Manchester. So it was the bed and other furniture, and quite possibly the bed along with, we know some wainscot posts from the same workshop, from the same timber survive. So perhaps the bed came north up to Manchester along with a sort of room, ensuite with a panelled room, which makes a lot of sense for the survival of the wainscot posts as well.
And so it's Mosley family tradition in Manchester that records that there's the gift of this ornately carved royal bed by Elizabeth I to Nicholas upon being knighted after being serving the year of office as Lord Mayor of London. And then the Mosleys keep hold of it along with all their other old furniture, which moves down to Staffordshire to their country house, Rollston Hall. Although they leave some behind, apparently, according to family tradition.
Well, we know it has a move from Hoff End to Ancoats, so it moves to Ancoats Hall.
Which is another Mosley property in Manchester.
Another Mosley property in Manchester, incredibly important because we know in the mid-18th century that Bonnie Prince Charlie goes and stays there. In 1744, the year before he comes down with his army to Manchester.
And then there's, in George's house, because George managed to acquire certain parts of the bed, there's a Jacobite achievement, a royal coat of arms with a very Jacobite Catholic overtones to it in terms of style, which match certain key characteristics of the bed. The dead wood motif that we find all over, speaking of rebirth. So
the pierced banderole, which we're seeing specifically on the bed, and you just don't see that anywhere else at all.
So the bed's given a Catholic...
Yes, it's been sort of pimped up, presumably for an expectant Stuart king to regain the throne. And interesting, we had dendro carried out on that, and the dendro actually came up with the result, which I think the last rings was 1695, so we can presume that this was done for the sort of 1715 Jacobite uprising.
For the Old Pretender.
For the Old Pretender, and then in 1744 at Ancoats, the Bonnie Prince Charlie was there.
So we fast forward a little bit that the Mosleys take all their furniture in various times from Manchester when they vacate the manor of Manchester, move to their country house in Staffordshire, Rollston Hall. George refurbishes the old furniture, which we assume it's at that point he takes various parts of this bed, some of which are installed in his house in Uppermill, others included within his work for Chetham's Library in Manchester. And he, interestingly, produces furniture en suite with this bed, and his forgeries, which he sells to people like the Duke of Northumberland, the Earl of Bradford, etc. He produces like furniture for the Mosleys. So there's no documentation that survives to support quite how that furniture was sold to the Mosleys, whether it was Shaw saying, well, you have this ancient royal bed, here's some more that you left behind, by the way, or actually admitting it's brand new, made en suite, because the interior photographs of Rollston Hall show it absolutely crammed with ancient Tudor style furniture or Elizabethan or 17th century. So they were clearly interested in this lineage, which goes through what Sir Oswald of the 19th century said. He loved family history. He was a historian. So there's no traced record of quite how George broached the supply of this other furniture to them.
No, we are just very fortunate to have those photographs from the 1890s showing that furniture in situ there.
And then what the furniture which we now have as well, one of the hall cupboards shows that Shaw's recreated certain characteristics from this bed, hasn't he? And those once again show this bed as being the template for a broad range of furniture, and the Mosleys are also in receipt of it, which is incredible. Given Shaw subscribed to to Sir Oswald's History of Tutbury Castle, and that Sir Oswald was a bona fide historian, you'd like to think that Shaw had supplied said furniture to him as en suite with his ancient family wares, but who knows? But there is a long-standing tradition of this bed being in Mosley possession well before George's involvement.
Yes, I mean the Mosleys were actually custodians of this bed for about 330 years. I mean we know it was still in Mosley possession right up until 1933.
Yes, that's exciting,
very
isn't
interesting.
it? Yes, another Sir Oswald, which people are probably going to be much more familiar with, Oswald's the Black Shirt. He attempted to gift this and other old family furniture back to Hough-End Hall in 1933 when the house was going to be potentially turned into a museum. Very generous of him. Quite why he did that, perhaps political favour, getting rid of some of the furniture that was just cluttering up the properties, we're not quite sure, but we know that the furniture was in his possession. It's been assumed that it was him trying to give it when he had no authority to give it, but it seems actually now that he had that furniture in his possession.
Yeah, and certainly some of the furniture did remain local to Rolleston, because the hall cupboard that we have now turned up just 6 miles down the road from Rolleston Hall.
It's incredible, isn't it? How short a distance it can move over that period of time. Yeah, I think it's amazing. It really shows the significance of this bed, and also the significance of this bed not only to the Tudor dynasty, but also to Manchester, through the Mosleys, and then the continued awareness this bed's relevance had to Manchester through until the 20th century, with Sir Oswald attempting to gift it back. It never happened because the hall was never turned into a museum, but I think it's a really, really interesting part of the bed's story.
Yeah.